So this video should be a two-parter. I'm doing the rear main seal on my 2005 SL55. This video ought to go with anybody that's trying to drop the transmission. A lot of videos on the rear main seal. Not many that I could find on some of the ins and outs of dropping the transmission. I did this on my quick jacks and the raised position. Brought the bottom of the oil pan, transmission oil pan, to 22 inches above the floor, which is probably about the minimum. So let me address some things up here that were really, I couldn't quite figure out. The work instruction doesn't say anything about bracing the engine. I'm out here working on my own. I didn't want to take any chance. So what I found was, this brace is on the back right now. When you go to take the transmission out, you got to tip the engine back a little bit and it comes out. And I thought, getting some input online, that the engine would be rear heavy and kind of rest toward the back. What actually happened, as soon as the transmission came off, the engine flipped forward and is resting on the front subframe, which I'll go in and show you. So I've got this on the back because eventually I'm going to have to jack the front of the engine, angle it back to get the transmission back on. And I don't want to go too far. And this brace on here is going to keep me from doing that. Probably if I were doing it again, I would start off putting this brace on the front of the engine. So as you tilt it down, you can kind of control it. It doesn't sort of flop down and hit the subframe. Didn't do any damage, but I don't know, it just kind of popped off of there and the engine slammed down. Potential, I suppose you could break the oil pan. Let me come down here underneath, show you some things. Hopefully this comes through. Obviously, I just lowered the engine out of the transmission tunnel. I can get it back. Plenty of room to work on the rear main seal. No reason for me to take it out of there, so I didn't bother. I took the drive shaft out, which is not, the WIS talks about just pulling the front of the shaft out. Most people don't take it out. Taking it out gave me a couple of advantages. One, it's not that hard once you get this far apart, especially if you're like me, you're working by yourself. With the transmission out, I was able to detach the shift lever from the gear shifter, which is available right there. And what really, I loosened up I loosened the transmission cross member, and I'll show you if I can find it. I took them back apart, but I was able to get to the two transmission bolts in the bell housing to the engine at the top. I was able to get, going from the back with the transmission off, about 4 extensions, wobble head extensions, or 2 were wobble heads, and I could come up from the back, get on those nuts and loosen those, break them loose, prior to lowering the transmission. WIS talks about lowering the transmission down, angling it down and trying to reach up in there, which I think would be a real pain. Without the drive shaft on, you don't need to do that. You can get it from the back. I'm planning to install them the same way. The other ones around, you can reach up and get a hold of those, no problem. I broke all of them kind of loose as I was getting ready to take it out, or I broke loose half of them, both of them at the top, and then I got my jack in place. And I'll show you this. So this is my Harbor Freight floor jack. That's a piece of MC 12 by 10.7 channel I cut off, and I drilled a hole in the top of it, removed the support pad on the jack and screwed it down to create my own little transmission jack, which worked great. Those notches in the side, I originally planned to strap the transmission down to the jack, but it was so heavy I didn't end up doing that. It's pretty stable on there. So I think that's about all. I can show you these are the things I couldn't figure out before. Try and make a second video so I go to put this back together. Any hints or tips on that? All right, second part of my video, R230. Drop the transmission, do the rear main seal. Tips, especially if you're working like I am by myself and on the garage floor. First thing, had a little tough time getting the transmission back in. You have to tilt the engine back. The weight bias of the engine is to the front. It actually went down and leaned on the cross member, and I ended up using my support stand to hoist the front of the engine. Didn't have a good way to get under the oil pan. Either way, you're going to need to tilt the engine back to get the transmission. Also, when I put my car on the lift, I used the longer block in the back, shorter block in the front on my quick jacks, just because that's the way it kind of sits naturally. So the transmission is flat though, coming up, and the car's tilted down, opposite of the way you want it to go. So if I had to do it again, I would definitely get the car flat, or maybe even the rear end down a little bit, make doing the transmission easier. Other thing, tightening the flywheel bolts. I've seen people, you can put a socket on the crankshaft. What I did, this is a piece of 1x3, and I had just sitting around my shop. I drilled a hole in it to fit this drift, this 1/4-inch drift. I stuck this in the transmission through the hole where you loosen up the torque converter bolts, so it fit, and this is deep enough to wedge against the side of that opening. And then in the front, through the torque converter bolt, mounting bolt, I just stuck this drift through the flex plate, obviously